They fired me via a text message in the middle of my wedding reception. The notification vibrated against my hip, a sharp, intrusive buzz that cut through the velvet warmth of the jazz band playing softly in the corner of the grand ballroom at the Drake Hotel. I was 33 years old, standing in a custom silk gown that had taken 6 months to bead by hand, resting my fingers lightly against the crisp lapel of my new husband's tuxedo. Leo was looking down at me with that rare, unshielded warmth he usually reserved for empty rooms and quiet mornings. But before he could lean in to kiss my forehead, my older sister Savannah intercepted the moment. Savannah had been circling my periphery all evening, her champagne flute constantly refilled, her eyes tracking every compliment I received with a familiar, toxic resentment. She lunged forward with the sloppy grace of a woman who had consumed too much expensive alcohol on someone else's dime, her manicured fingers snatching my phone from the hidden pocket of my dress before I could even register her presence. "Let's see who is interrupting the bride," she announced, her voice artificially loud, designed specifically to shatter the intimacy Leo and I were sharing. The lock screen was lit up, displaying a preview of the message. I saw the sender's name, Preston, the arrogant 30-something son of Onyx Logistics founder, a man who had just inherited the CEO title less than 48 hours ago. I reached for the phone, keeping my movements measured and calm, not wanting to create a scene. But Savannah stepped back, her eyes scanning the glowing text. A slow, malicious smile spread across her face, stretching her dark lipstick into a cruel line. She didn't hand it back. Instead, she turned toward the center of the room, tapping her acrylic nail against her crystal glass, the sharp clinking sound demanding the attention of the 150 guests, a curated mix of our family and Chicago's corporate elite. "Oh, listen to this, everyone," Savannah practically sang, her voice echoing over the sudden silence of the ballroom as the jazz band falteringly stopped playing. My mother, Yvonne, who had been sitting at the head table looking thoroughly bored by my happiness all night, suddenly perked up. She stood, smoothing her emerald green dress, a dress I had paid for, and moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Savannah. They looked like two vultures who had just spotted an injured lamb. Savannah cleared her throat, holding the phone up like a twisted trophy, and read the message loudly enough for the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling to carry every word. "Nia, your services as Chief Operating Officer at Onyx Logistics are no longer required. You are terminated effective immediately. Security has already packed your office. Enjoy the honeymoon." The words hung in the suffocating silence of the room, the shock on the faces of my colleagues, the gasps from Leo's conservative, old-money family, the hushed whispers that immediately erupted. It was a symphony of public humiliation carefully orchestrated by a fragile boy playing CEO, amplified by the very women who shared my blood. Before I tell you exactly what I did next, standing there in my white dress while my own mother and sister reveled in my sudden professional execution, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many of you understand the exact kind of pain that comes from the people who are supposed to protect you. I didn't drop my gaze. I didn't let a single tear touch my mascara. I felt Leo's hand slip around my waist, his long fingers pressing firmly into the small of my back, an anchor of pure, cold logic in a room spiraling into gossip. Leo was a senior forensic auditor. He dismantled fraudulent corporations for a living. He didn't panic, and because of him, neither did I. I looked directly at my mother. Yvonne wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at me with triumph. For 10 years, I had been the golden goose, the youngest female COO in the Midwest logistics sector, the woman who paid off her mortgage, funded Savannah's failed boutique businesses, and served as the unbreakable backbone of a family that only loved me when my checkbook was open. They hated my success because it reminded them of their own stagnation. And now, seeing me publicly stripped of my title on the most important night of my life, they thought they were witnessing my destruction. They thought the well had finally run dry and that I would be reduced to a weeping, broken shell, forced to crawl back to them for emotional support. "Well," my mother said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy that was loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "I always told you that you were working too hard for those white men, Nia. You put all your eggs in one basket thinking you were irreplaceable. Now look at you, fired via text message, on your wedding day." She shook her head, taking a slow sip of her champagne. "You should have focused more on being a woman and less on trying to run a man's world." Savannah laughed, a sharp, grating sound, as she finally tossed the phone onto the white linen tablecloth. "Guess you're not the boss anymore, little sister," she sneered. Several guests looked away in discomfort. Arthur, the retiring founder of Onyx and Preston's father, was seated at table 4. I saw him lower his head, his face flushing dark red with second-hand embarrassment and shame for his son's cowardice. Preston hadn't even had the nerve to do it in person. He had waited until the exact moment he knew I would be surrounded by everyone I loved to drop the guillotine. He wanted to break me. He wanted to establish his new dominance by publicly slaughtering his most competent executive, the woman who had essentially run his father's company while he was busy wrecking sports cars and playing golf in Miami. What Preston didn't know, what my mother and sister couldn't possibly comprehend in their shallow, spiteful joy, was that I was not just an employee at Onyx Logistics. I was not merely a hired manager who could be discarded with a few taps on a screen. 7 years ago, when the company was on the verge of bankruptcy due to catastrophic routing inefficiencies, I had written a proprietary predictive logistics algorithm. I had coded it entirely on my own time, on my own personal servers, before I was ever promoted to the executive suite. When Arthur begged to use it, I agreed, but I didn't sell it to him. I licensed it. The $50 million global supply chain that Onyx operated, the automated dispatching, the real-time freight tracking, the automated customs clearance that kept the company breathing, was running entirely on my personal intellectual property. And buried deep within the 200-page licensing agreement, hidden behind layers of dense legal jargon that Leo had personally helped me draft during our 2nd year of dating, was a very specific, automated termination clause. If my employment was terminated without cause, without a 90-day transition period, and without a unanimous vote from the board of directors, the licensing agreement was immediately revoked. Not tomorrow, not next week. The absolute second my employee credentials were deactivated in the HR system, the algorithm would automatically execute a kill switch, pulling my proprietary code from Onyx's mainframe to protect my intellectual property from corporate theft. Preston thought he was firing a 33-year-old black woman who had gotten too big for her boots. He had no idea he had just unplugged the life support machine for a logistics empire. I picked up my phone from the table. The screen was still glowing with his message. I looked at the timestamp. 8:42 p.m. Right about now, the night shift dispatchers at the Chicago hub were staring at blank screens. Right about now, 300 freight trucks were losing their GPS routing data. Right about now, Preston was popping a bottle of expensive scotch, completely unaware that he had just incinerated his father's legacy. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I turned to Leo. His jaw was set, his dark eyes scanning the room, calculating the shifting allegiances of the guests. "Are you all right, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, his voice low, a private rumble meant only for me. I looked up at him, feeling a slow, dangerous warmth spread through my chest. The heavy burden of being the strong one for a company that didn't respect me and a family that actively despised me suddenly lifted. I was free. I smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that caused the triumphant smirk on my sister's face to falter. "I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Sterling," I replied smoothly. I turned back to face my mother and sister. The ballroom was holding its breath, waiting for the bride to break down in hysterics, waiting for the stereotypical explosion of anger, the screaming match, the tears ruining my makeup. I gave them nothing. I smoothed the front of my silk gown, reached out and picked up my glass of champagne. "Thank you for sharing that with the room, Savannah," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, pleasant, and utterly devoid of the devastation she was praying for. "It saves me the trouble of drafting a resignation letter on Monday. Now, if you'll excuse me, the band is waiting." I didn't wait for her response. I didn't wait for my mother's next barbed insult. I simply turned my back on them. I signaled the band leader with a subtle nod, and the soft, rolling notes of Etta James filled the silence once again. Leo pulled me against him, and we stepped back onto the dance floor. We moved in perfect synchrony, the heavy silk of my dress swirling around us. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the confusion rippling through the crowd. They didn't understand why I wasn't falling apart. I could see Savannah staring at me, her mouth slightly open, the phone forgotten on the table, entirely robbed of the chaotic spectacle she had tried to orchestrate. My mother sat back down heavily, her brow furrowed in deep irritation that her poison hadn't worked. They wanted me on my knees, but I was busy dancing with my husband. As we swayed under the crystal chandelier, Leo leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear. "Do you think he knows yet?" he whispered. "Preston?" I murmured, resting my cheek against his chest, listening to the steady, calm beat of his heart. "Not yet. He probably thinks the system glitch is just a server error. He'll call it. It will tell him they are locked out. Then he'll call the legal department. Legal will open the file." I took a deep breath, the scent of white roses and Leo's cologne filling my senses. By midnight, he will realize he doesn't have a company anymore. Leo let out a soft, dark chuckle. "And your family?" I glanced over his shoulder. Savannah was angrily drinking from a new glass, glaring daggers at my back, while Yvonne was whispering furiously to an aunt who looked entirely uncomfortable. They had lived off my exhaustion for a decade. They had used my corporate salary as their personal ATM while mocking the long hours and the stress that provided it. They thought the money was over, but they didn't know the truth. I was the one who owned the algorithm. The venture capitalists who had poured money into Onyx were going to demand answers by Monday morning. When they realized Preston had destroyed the company out of petty ego, they would force him out. They would come to me. And when they did, I wasn't going back to being an employee. I was going to buy the company for pennies on the dollar, and I was going to do it with Leo's firm auditing every single cent Preston had stolen during his 2 days as CEO. The life I had built as a sacrificial lamb was officially dead. The era of my quiet sovereignty had begun. We finished the dance. We cut the 4-tier red velvet cake, smiling for the photographers with the brilliant, unbothered radiance of a couple entirely secure in their future. We thanked our guests, shaking hands with the corporate executives who were looking at me with a mixture of pity and awkwardness, completely blind to the fact that by next week, I would be their boss. We walked out of the Drake Hotel at exactly 11 o'clock, the cool Chicago night air hitting my face like a baptism. The valet pulled Leo's black town car around to the front. As he opened the door for me, I paused, looking back at the glowing golden doors of the hotel lobby. I knew my mother and sister were still inside, likely holding court, drinking my liquor and gossiping about my supposed downfall. They believed they had watched me lose everything tonight. They had no idea they had just watched me drop the heavy, thankless burden of carrying them, leaving them to drown in the very reality they had created. I stepped into the back of the car, the heavy doors thudding shut behind us, sealing us in the quiet, leather-scented darkness. I finally pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up. 78 missed calls. 42 from Arthur, 30 from the Onyx IT department, and 6 from Preston. The panicked voicemails were already rolling in. I didn't listen to a single one. With a calm, deliberate swipe of my thumb, I powered the device entirely off, dropping it into my purse. "Where to, Mrs. Sterling?" Leo asked, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water from the console. "Home," I said, taking the glass from his hand, the cool condensation matching the absolute ice in my veins. "Let them burn in the dark until Monday." The ride back to our home was wrapped in a heavy, luxurious silence that felt more like a sanctuary than a simple commute. the dark-tinted windows of the town car shielding us from the glittering, rain-slicked streets of downtown Chicago as we left the Drake Hotel far behind us. I leaned my head against the cool leather of the seat, feeling the subtle, rhythmic hum of the engine beneath me, a stark contrast to the chaotic, venomous energy that had suffocated the ballroom just 20 minutes prior. Leo kept his hand resting firmly on my thigh, his thumb drawing slow, rhythmic circles against the silk of my dress. An anchor of pure, unbothered stability in a world that was currently imploding without my intervention. I didn't need to look at my phone to know exactly what was happening in the server rooms of Onyx Logistics. I had designed the kill switch with the same meticulous, paranoid precision that I had used to survive my mother's emotional warfare for the past 3 decades. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the moment the outsourced weekend HR coordinator blindly processed Preston's spiteful termination order, my proprietary algorithm, the digital nervous system of a $50 million empire, recognized the unauthorized severance of its creator. It didn't crash. Crashing would imply an accident. It executed a flawlessly choreographed withdrawal. Millions of lines of code, the very logic that dictated the movement of 300 freight trucks across the eastern seaboard, the automated customs clearance APIs that allowed millions of dollars of cargo to cross international borders seamlessly, and the predictive routing software that saved the company from bankruptcy 7 years ago immediately encrypted themselves and initiated a hard recall to my private, heavily fortified offshore servers. Right now, in the fluorescent-lit dispatch center on the south side of the city, monitors were blinking from intricate real-time maps to stark, unforgiving black screens displaying a single line of automated text. Error 404. License revoked. Administrator access denied. Preston, who had undoubtedly spent the last hour basking in the false glory of his petty power trip, accepting congratulations from his sycophant friends while drinking his father's expensive scotch, was about to receive the most terrifying phone call of his utterly unearned life. I closed my eyes, letting out a breath that I felt like I'd been holding since I was 22 years old, the year I first took the job at Onyx to pay off the second mortgage my mother had secretly taken out on our childhood home. For 11 years, I had been the unbreakable mule, the prodigy who sacrificed her youth, her weekends, and her peace of mind to build a fortune for a white family that saw me as a highly efficient tool, all while funding the lifestyle of a black family that saw me as an endless, uncomplaining ATM. My mother, Yvonne, and my sister, Savannah, had never forgiven me for outgrowing the miserable, stagnant narrative they had written for themselves. They viewed my success not as an inspiration, but as a direct insult to their own lack of ambition, punishing me for my achievements by demanding I finance their failures. Every time Savannah launched a doomed online boutique or crashed a leased luxury car, I wrote the check. Every time my mother demanded a kitchen renovation to impress her church friends or needed to cover a mysterious gap in her finances, I quietly transferred the funds, swallowing the bitter pill of their transactional love, because I had been conditioned to believe that a strong black woman's ultimate duty was to carry the dead weight of her bloodline until her spine snapped. But tonight, standing in that ballroom, watching them weaponize my public execution, watching them laugh and toast to my supposed destruction alongside the arrogant boy who had inherited the empire I built, the conditioning finally completely shattered. I wasn't sad. The overwhelming emotion flooding my chest wasn't grief. It was an intoxicating, absolute liberation. The heavy, suffocating cape of the strong black woman that I had been draped in for over a decade fell to the floor, leaving me light, dangerous, and perfectly cold. When we arrived at our penthouse overlooking the lake, the city below us was a sea of glittering lights, oblivious to the corporate massacre unfolding within its limits. Leo unlocked the door, the familiar scent of our home, cedarwood and subtle vanilla, greeting us like an old friend. He didn't ask if I needed to cry. He didn't offer hollow platitudes. He simply helped me unzip the heavy silk of my wedding gown, his hands gentle and reverent, before pouring me a glass of ice water and pressing a kiss to my bare shoulder. "The algorithm?" he asked quietly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of our bedroom. "Gone," I replied, stepping out of the dress and letting it pool on the hardwood floor like a discarded skin. By now, every truck in the fleet is flying blind. The warehouse management system is locked. They can't load, they can't unload, they can't route, and they can't bill. Leo's lips curved into a sharp, predatory smile, the smile of a forensic auditor who lived to dismantle the arrogant and the corrupt. "Good," he murmured, pulling me against his chest. "Let them bleed out." We slept that night with a profound, untroubled peace, wrapped in the quiet sanctuary of our new marriage, completely insulated from the frantic, apocalyptic panic that was undoubtedly tearing through the Onyx executive team. When I woke up on Sunday morning, the sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, golden shadows across the room, and the rich, dark aroma of espresso was drifting in from the kitchen. For the first time in my 33 years, I woke up without the crushing, immediate anxiety of having to solve someone else's emergency. There was no panicked text from the warehouse manager about a missed delivery. There was no manipulative voicemail from my mother complaining about a past-due bill. There was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the lake crashing against the breakwater, and the comforting clinking of Leo setting ceramic mugs on the marble island. I slipped into a thick cashmere robe, tied it loosely around my waist, and walked into the kitchen, leaning against the counter to watch my husband work. He was already dressed in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he stared intensely at his laptop screen. "Morning, Mrs. Sterling," he said without looking up, his fingers flying across the keyboard with lethal precision. "How's the apocalypse looking?" I asked, wrapping both hands around the hot mug of espresso he slid across the counter toward me. "Catastrophic," he replied, finally looking up, his dark eyes gleaming with a dangerous, satisfied light. "I've been monitoring the dark web chatter and the industry forums. The rumors are already leaking. Shippers are reporting massive delays. Onyx's portal is completely dead, and based on the back-end financial footprints I've been tracing since 4:00 a.m., Preston didn't just fire you to stroke his own ego. He fired you because you were the only one standing in the way of his creative accounting." I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth grounding me as I walked over to the dining table, finally pulling my phone out of my purse where it had rested since we left the hotel. I held down the power button, watching the screen flicker to life, knowing exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of the loading screen. The phone immediately began to vibrate violently, a sustained, desperate buzzing as the backlog of notifications flooded the device in a chaotic avalanche. 142 missed calls. The notification bar was a solid wall of red alerts, 45 voicemails, hundreds of text messages. I bypassed the texts from my mother and sister, which I knew would be a mix of fake concern and probing gossip, and scrolled directly to the communications from the Onyx executive team. Arthur, the man who had built the company but foolishly handed the keys to his incompetent son, had called me 52 times. His text messages read like the diary of a man watching his life's work burn to ash in real time. The first message, sent at 11:30 p.m. last night. "Nia, Preston is an idiot. The system is down. Call it and give them the override code. We will fix this tomorrow." By 1:00 a.m., the tone shifted from annoyance to panic. "Nia, they are telling me the algorithm is gone. Completely gone. Please tell me this is a glitch. Pick up the phone. Whatever he said, I am voiding the termination." By 4:00 a.m., the panic had morphed into absolute groveling desperation. "Nia, please. The entire East Coast fleet is grounded. We have medical supplies expiring on the docks. We are bleeding $500,000 an hour. I am begging you, call me back." I read the words with zero emotion, feeling absolutely no pity for the man who had stood by and watched his son humiliate me in front of my family, hoping I would just quietly accept the severance package and disappear. Then I opened Preston's messages. The fragile, inflated ego of the new CEO was perfectly documented in the devolution of his texts. At midnight, "Turn the system back on, Nia. This isn't funny. You're violating company policy." At 2:00 a.m., "I'm calling the police. You are stealing corporate property. You will be in jail by morning." At 5:00 a.m., "Nia, answer the phone. The lawyers are saying the licensing agreement was tied to your employment. Is that true? Did you seriously trick my dad into signing that?" And finally, at 7:30 a.m., just an hour ago, the ultimate collapse of his arrogant facade. "Nia, please, I messed up. I was drunk. The investors are calling. They are threatening to pull funding. Dad is threatening to disown me. I will double your salary. Just fix it, please." I locked the phone and set it face down on the marble counter, the sound a sharp, final click in the quiet kitchen. "He's offering to double my salary," I said to Leo, my voice flat, devoid of any triumph or amusement. Leo laughed, a short, dark sound that held no humor. "He doesn't have a salary to offer you. By tomorrow morning, he won't have a company." Leo turned his laptop around so I could see the screen, which was filled with complex spreadsheets, offshore routing numbers, and highlighted discrepancies that painted a devastating picture of corporate embezzlement. While you were running the operations and keeping the company profitable, Preston was using a shell corporation in Delaware to siphon off operational expenses. He's been billing Onyx for phantom consulting fees, inflating maintenance contracts, and routing the difference into a private trust. $4 million over the last 18 months. I stared at the numbers, the cold, hard proof of his theft staring back at me, and suddenly his desperate need to fire me made perfect sense. As COO, I was scheduled to initiate a comprehensive internal audit next month ahead of our new funding round. I would have found the missing $4 million within days. He had to get rid of me, and he used my wedding day to do it, hoping the emotional devastation of a public firing, amplified by my toxic family, would break my spirit and keep me distracted long enough for him to cover his tracks. He thought I was just another emotional, easily manipulated woman who would retreat into shame and silence. He miscalculated entirely. "Do you have enough to hand over to the SEC?" I asked, my eyes scanning the damning evidence of his incompetence and greed. "I have enough to hand over to the SEC, the DOJ, and the IRS," Leo replied smoothly, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. "The forensic packet will be fully compiled by tonight, but before we drop the guillotine on Preston, we need to deal with the immediate fallout. The venture capitalists, the board, they are going to realize very quickly that Preston is a liability and that you are holding the only asset that matters. They will try to negotiate." I picked up my empty mug and walked over to the sink, looking out at the gray, churning waters of Lake Michigan. "I'm not negotiating," I said softly, the absolute certainty of my decision settling deep into my bones, hardening into an unbreakable diamond of resolve. "I own the algorithm. They need the algorithm to survive. I will not license it back to them, and I will not return as an employee to clean up Preston's mess. If they want the system turned back on, they will have to sell me the company. Pennies on the dollar, complete controlling interest. And Preston steps down, publicly, before the federal indictments even hit the news." Leo stood up, walking up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "A hostile takeover," he murmured, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "From the woman they fired via text message. It's perfectly ruthless, Mrs. Sterling." I leaned back against him, closing my eyes and letting the reality of my new existence wash over me. For so long, I had believed that my value was tied to my utility. My mother had taught me that I was only worthy of love if I was providing, solving, and sacrificing. She had conditioned me to believe that my exhaustion was a badge of honor, that my endless endurance was the only thing keeping our family from collapsing. But as I stood there in the quiet luxury of my home, preparing to dismantle an empire and build my own, I realized the most heartbreaking, liberating truth of all. They never needed me to be strong. They just needed me to be compliant. My mother and sister didn't hate me because I worked too hard. They hated me because I had the audacity to build a life that didn't revolve around their dysfunction. They mocked me at my wedding because they thought stripping away my corporate title would finally reduce me to their level, forcing me back into the role of the subservient, desperate daughter begging for their conditional affection. They thought I was the backbone of the family, but a backbone is just a structure meant to carry weight that isn't its own. I was done carrying. Tomorrow morning, I wouldn't be walking into Onyx Logistics as a humiliated former employee begging for my job back, and I certainly wouldn't be answering the inevitable, panicking phone calls from my mother when she realized her personal ATM had been permanently shut down. I would be walking in as the executioner. Let them panic today. Let Preston sweat through his designer suits. Let Arthur realize that his legacy was destroyed by his own blind nepotism. Let my mother and sister gossip and gloat in their ignorance, completely unaware that the financial safety net they had abused for a decade had just been incinerated. Today was Sunday, a day of rest, and I intended to enjoy every single second of my absolute, terrifying quiet before I burned their entire world to the ground on Monday morning. The tranquility of our Sunday morning was profound, a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaos I knew was currently suffocating the executive board of Onyx Logistics. The morning sunlight sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our living room, creating a perfect, moody Rembrandt lighting effect across the hardwood floors, casting deep, rich shadows that gave the space the cinematic texture of a vintage 35mm film still. I sat on the edge of our plush velvet sofa, taking in the low depth of field composition of the room. Everything in the periphery seemed beautifully blurred, leaving only Leo, sitting at the marble kitchen island with his laptop, perfectly in focus like a subject captured through an Otis 85mm f1. 4-lens. I had traded my suffocating corporate armor, the tailored blazers and pencil skirts, for something entirely my own, dressed in a thick, minimalist streetwear hoodie with structured drop shoulder seams and a pair of sleek, high-end athletic joggers, finding comfort in the heavy, premium cotton that felt like a protective shell against the remnants of yesterday's betrayal. I was sipping my second espresso when the absolute silence of the penthouse was shattered by the sharp, jarring buzz of the security intercom. I didn't flinch. I simply lowered my mug, the ceramic clinking softly against the glass coffee table, and turned my gaze toward the digital display mounted on the wall near the foyer. Leo stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, his dark eyes meeting mine with a silent question. I stood up, the soft fabric of my streetwear brushing against my legs, and walked slowly toward the monitor. The high-definition camera feed from the ground floor lobby displayed my older sister, Savannah. She looked terrible. The flawless, venomous composure she had weaponized just 12 hours ago at my wedding reception had completely evaporated. Her designer dress was wrinkled. She was wearing oversized sunglasses to hide what was undoubtedly a massive hangover, and her hands were visibly trembling as she leaned heavily against the brass intercom panel. She buzzed again, a frantic, sustained press of the button that echoed aggressively through our quiet sanctuary. I reached out and tapped the screen, opening the two-way audio but keeping the lobby doors locked. "Yes," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of the panic she was desperate to infect me with. "Nia! Oh my God, Nia, let me up!" Savannah practically shrieked into the speaker, her voice cracking with a raw, unfiltered terror that I had never heard from her before. "The doorman won't let me pass the desk. You need to let me up right now. It's an absolute emergency." I didn't press the unlock button. I leaned my shoulder against the wall, crossing my arms. "It's Sunday morning, Savannah. I am on my honeymoon, resting in my own home. There are no emergencies here." A desperate sob hitched in her throat, a sound that, a year ago, would have sent me rushing downstairs with an open checkbook and an anxious heart. But today it felt entirely hollow, a cheap manipulation tactic from a woman who had publicly laughed at my firing. "Mom is having a panic attack, Nia. The stock, the internal shares," she stammered, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper as if she was afraid the lobby concierge would hear her. "We got a mass email from the board. The system is completely down. The entire supply chain is frozen. They're saying the company is in a blackout and that the venture capitalists are threatening to pull their equity by tomorrow morning. The internal stock price is tanking on the private market. Mom leveraged her house against those shares, Nia. If the company goes under, she loses everything. We all lose everything." I stared at her through the pixelated screen, absorbing the absolute poetic justice of the situation. Over the years, Onyx had awarded me thousands of restricted stock units as bonuses instead of cash, a cheap way for Arthur to keep me chained to the desk. Because I was the dutiful, self-sacrificing daughter, I had quietly transferred a significant portion of those shares to my mother and sister, trying to build them a foundation of generational wealth they refused to build for themselves. My mother, in her infinite greed, had secretly used those shares as collateral for a massive, high-interest loan to fund her lavish lifestyle, banking on my algorithm to keep the company's valuation soaring indefinitely. She had bet the house on my genius, and then she had stood in a ballroom and cheered as I was fired. "That sounds like a terrible financial decision on her part," I replied calmly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "But as Preston so loudly informed everyone last night, I am no longer the chief operating officer of Onyx Logistics. The company's stock valuation is no longer my concern." Savannah gasped, hitting the intercom panel with her palm. "Are you insane? You wrote the system, Nia. Preston is an idiot. Everyone knows he was just throwing his weight around. But you can't just let the company die." Arthur called Mom crying at 6 in the morning. He said you locked the algorithm. He said you took it entirely offline. You have to give them the password. You have to turn it back on right now, or we are going to be bankrupt by Tuesday. The sheer, staggering entitlement in her words hung in the air, thick and nauseating. She wasn't here to apologize for ruining my wedding. She wasn't here to comfort me after being humiliated. She was here to demand that I rescue her, yet again from a fire she had gleefully watched someone else set. "There is no password, Savannah," I said softly, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure washing over me. "It's not a router you can just reboot. It's a proprietary intellectual property license that was legally revoked the second my HR profile was deactivated." Preston unplugged the machine. I just took my machine back. "You owe us this!" she screamed, abandoning the fake tears and reverting immediately to the bitter, demanding sister I knew so well. "You can't do this to your own family. Mom put a roof over your head. I am your blood. You're going to let Mom lose her house over your stupid, petty pride? Just give them the damn code, Nia." I watched her chest heaving on the monitor, the absolute delusion written across her face. "My pride?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that silenced her instantly. "You stood in front of 150 people drinking champagne I paid for in a dress I bought you, and you mocked me. You and Mom watched Preston try to publicly strip me of my dignity, and you smiled. You thought my era of usefulness was over, and you were thrilled to see me put in my place. But you didn't realize that my place was the only thing holding up the ceiling above your heads. I don't owe you my intellectual property. I don't owe Mom a bailout for her secret debts. And I certainly don't owe Onyx Logistics a single line of code." Before she could formulate another scream, I reached out and tapped the end call icon. The screen went black. The silence in the penthouse rushed back in, pure, clean, and undisturbed. I stood there for a moment, letting the finality of the action settle into my bones. I had just cut the rope. For 33 years, I had dragged their dead weight up the mountain, terrified of what would happen if I let go. Now I knew. They would fall, and I would finally be able to breathe. I walked back into the living room, my sneakers completely silent on the hardwood, and sank back into the velvet sofa. Leo was watching me over the top of his laptop screen, a small, incredibly proud smile playing on his lips. "She's gone," I said simply. "The doorman just texted. He escorted her out," Leo confirmed, checking his phone before turning his attention back to his spreadsheets. And you'll be pleased to know that while your sister was having her meltdown in the lobby, Preston was having his own private panic attack in my inbox. I raised an eyebrow, tucking my legs underneath me. Your inbox? He figured out that threatening you wasn't working, so he decided to try the husband. Leo chuckled darkly, adjusting his reading glasses. He sent me a cease and desist letter at 9:00 a.m., drafted by some junior attorney who clearly hasn't slept, threatening to sue me for corporate espionage if I don't force my wife to return company property. I felt a brief flash of irritation. They're really trying to claim the algorithm belongs to them. They can try whatever they want, Leo dismissed with a wave of his hand, his eyes scanning the endless rows of financial data that represented Preston's doom. But it's a bluff, and Arthur knows it. The licensing agreement is ironclad. It was filed with the Patent Office 3 years ago, entirely under your name, explicitly detached from your W-2 employment. They don't have a legal leg to stand on, which is why Preston is escalating his threats to me. He's cornered. The venture capitalists have officially called an emergency board meeting for 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. He turned the laptop toward me, the screen filled with dense, highlighted ledgers that looked like a foreign language to anyone but a forensic auditor. And this is what we are going to bring to that meeting, Leo continued, his voice dropping into that serious, lethal tone he used when he was about to dismantle a corrupt executive. I finished compiling the embezzlement packet. It's flawless, Naya. Preston wasn't even smart about it. He used a series of shell companies registered to a P.O. box in Delaware to bill Onyx for phantom consulting services. He authorized the payments himself, bypassing the account's payable safeguards because he had Arthur's executive override codes. $4.2 million, systematically drained from the operational budget over 18 months, funneled directly into a private offshore trust. I stared at the numbers, the sheer audacity of his theft making my blood run cold. Arthur gave him the override codes? Arthur trusted his son, Leo said, leaning back in his chair. A fatal error in business. Tomorrow morning, when the 3 main venture capitalists demand an explanation for why their $50 million logistics network is currently a dead piece of metal, Preston is going to try to blame you. He's going to say you're a disgruntled former employee holding the company hostage. But before he can even finish his sentence, I am going to slide this audit across the table. I'm going to show the board exactly why Preston fired the only executive competent enough to catch his theft. It wasn't about ego, Nia. It was about survival. He knew your department audit was scheduled for next month. He had to eliminate you. So he tried to bury me, I murmured, the entire picture finally snapping into perfect, devastating clarity. He hadn't just fired me out of spite. He had fired me out of sheer, desperate self-preservation, hoping the shock of a public, humiliating termination would break me down and force me to walk away quietly without looking at the books. He had used my toxic family to amplify the damage, trusting that my mother and sister would keep me so emotionally distracted that I wouldn't fight back. It was a calculated, cowardly assassination attempt. He tried, Leo agreed softly, closing the laptop with a decisive, echoing snap, and instead he handed you the detonator. I looked out the window, the Sunday morning sun burning away the last remnants of the gray Chicago fog. Tomorrow, I would not be wearing streetwear. Tomorrow, I would put my armor back on. I would walk into the glass-walled boardroom of Onyx Logistics, not as the tireless, underappreciated COO, not as the sacrificial daughter, and not as the victim of a cruel corporate joke. I would walk in as the executioner. My mother would lose her house, Savannah would lose her illusion of wealth, and Preston would lose his freedom. The era of my endless grace was officially over. The era of consequences had begun. The Monday morning air in Chicago was crisp and unapologetically cold, carrying the sharp scent of exhaust and damp asphalt as Leo's black town car navigated the congested lanes of the Kennedy Expressway toward the sprawling industrial complex that housed the global headquarters of Onyx Logistics. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the muted gray skyline, feeling an absolute, profound stillness radiating from my core, a quiet sovereignty that had replaced the chronic, buzzing anxiety that used to govern my every waking moment. For the past decade, my Monday mornings had been defined by a frantic, suffocating rush to put out fires I hadn't started, answering emails before dawn, fielding panicked calls from incompetent regional managers, and mentally preparing to carry the operational weight of a $50 million empire while a boardroom full of mediocre men took the credit. But today, I was not wearing the exhausted, accommodating face of the dutiful chief operating officer, nor was I wearing the soft, forgiving mask of the sacrificial daughter. Today I was wearing a meticulously tailored, charcoal gray bespoke suit with a crisp white silk blouse buttoned to the collarbone, my hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon that left my face entirely exposed, offering no place for their projected insecurities to hide. Leo drove in comfortable silence, his demeanor as cool and clinical as the polished leather briefcase resting on the back seat, a briefcase that contained the heavily documented, undeniable proof of Preston's $4 million offshore embezzlement, the final nail in the coffin of the boy king's brief and disastrous reign. As we took the exit toward the industrial park, the abstract reality of my algorithm's absence suddenly manifested into a breathtaking physical spectacle of absolute chaos. The two-lane access road leading to the Onyx compound was completely paralyzed, choked by a miles-long convoy of massive 18-wheel freight trucks idling aggressively, their diesel engines rumbling in a collective, frustrated growl that vibrated through the floorboards of our car. Independent contractors and union drivers were out of their cabs, standing in angry clusters on the median, smoking cigarettes, yelling into their radios, and waving crumpled dispatch manifests at the overwhelmed, terrified security guards stationed at the main gate. Without my proprietary routing code, the automated dock scheduling system had flatlined. The warehouse doors were locked in a default security state. The loading bays were blind, and millions of dollars of time-sensitive cargo, including perishable medical supplies and high-value electronics, were sitting in a logistical purgatory, bleeding capital with every passing second. Leo slowed the car, navigating through the angry sea of trucks with a calm, predatory grace, the tinted windows shielding us from the hostile glares of the drivers who were losing money by the minute. When we reached the main security checkpoint, a young, frantic guard I didn't recognize stepped out, holding up his hand to stop the vehicle, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the morning chill. I rolled down my window just enough for him to see my face. The guard's eyes widened, recognition flashing instantly as he took in my sharp, unbothered expression. He had likely received panicked, contradictory orders all weekend about me, but the innate authority I carried, the authority of the woman who actually ran this compound, overrode whatever childish directive Preston had issued. The guard swallowed hard, immediately stepping back and raising the automated barrier without a single word, allowing us to glide smoothly into the reserved executive parking structure. We parked in Leo's usual visitor spot, ignoring the chaotic flurry of mid-level managers sprinting across the tarmac with stacks of useless paper, their faces etched with the kind of primal panic that only comes when the digital floor collapses beneath them. I stepped out of the car, the sharp, deliberate click of my stiletto heels echoing against the concrete, a steady, rhythmic metronome counting down the final minutes of Preston's corporate life. Leo walked beside me, his long strides matching mine, his presence a dark, silent wall of absolute protection. As we approached the towering glass facade of the main lobby, the sheer scale of the internal collapse became undeniable. The normally hushed, intimidatingly sleek reception area looked like the floor of the stock exchange during a crash. The massive digital screens that usually displayed real-time global tracking metrics of our fleet were completely black, save for a single blinking line of white text in the center of each monitor. Error 404, license revoked, critical system failure. Dozens of employees were clustered around the front desk, shouting over each other, holding dead tablets and desk phones that had been completely overwhelmed by the volume of inbound client fury. At the center of this maelstrom stood Daryl, the head of corporate security, a broad-shouldered, incredibly observant man in his late 50s who had been with Onyx since the beginning, a man who knew exactly who built the company and who was currently destroying it. As I pushed through the revolving glass doors, the ambient roar of the lobby seemed to falter, a ripple of shocked silence spreading outward from my point of entry as people turned, their eyes wide, watching the terminated COO walk into the blast zone with the terrifying calm of a woman who owned the detonator. Daryl saw me immediately. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't step forward to block my path. He simply stood there, his heavy gaze resting on me. A profound, almost invisible sigh of relief dropping his shoulders as he realized the adult had finally returned to the room. I walked directly toward him, the crowd parting seamlessly, stepping back as if avoiding the heat of an invisible fire. "Morning, Daryl," I said, my voice quiet, smooth, and completely unaffected by the surrounding hysteria. "Good morning, Miss Nia," Daryl rumbled, his deep voice carrying a distinct tone of absolute respect, pointedly ignoring the termination notice that had undoubtedly been plastered across his desk all weekend. "It's a bit of a mess up there today. Mr. Preston has been screaming at the server rack since 4 a.m. I allowed a micro-expression of cold amusement to touch the corner of my mouth. "I imagine he has. Are the venture capitalists in the boardroom?" Daryl nodded slowly, his eyes flicking briefly to Leo and the leather briefcase he carried. "They arrived 10 minutes ago. Mr. Arthur is with them. They don't look happy. Preston gave me explicit orders to have you arrested for corporate trespassing the second you stepped on the property." Daryl paused, a slow, dark smile spreading across his weathered face. "But my radio seems to be malfunctioning this morning. Let me escort you to the private elevator, ma'am." He turned, using his massive frame to clear a path through the gawking employees, leading us to the secure executive lift that bypassed the lower administrative floors. As the polished steel doors slid shut, sealing us in the quiet hum of the ascending car, I adjusted the cuffs of my suit, feeling the final lingering traces of my old subservience burn away, leaving nothing but an impenetrable armor of self-worth. When the elevator chimed and the doors opened on the 50th floor, the smell of stale coffee, cold sweat, and sheer, unfiltered terror hit me like a physical wave. The executive suite, normally a sanctuary of hushed voices and expensive leather, was completely unspooled. IT technicians were running back and forth with tangles of Ethernet cables, looking utterly defeated, while the legal team stood in a tight, panicked circle outside Preston's office, furiously whispering and flipping through thick binders of useless corporate bylaws. And there, standing in the center of the hallway, screaming into his mobile phone with a red, violently flushed face, was Preston. He looked entirely pathetic. His expensive, tailored Italian suit was wrinkled, his tie was pulled down and hanging loosely around his neck, and his hair, usually slicked back into an arrogant shell, was sticking up in sweaty tufts. He was the perfect, tragic picture of an entitled boy who had finally broken a toy he didn't know how to fix. He slammed the phone down against the receptionist's marble desk, shattering the screen, his chest heaving as he turned and suddenly locked eyes with me. For a split second, a flash of genuine, visceral terror crossed his face, a momentary recognition of his own absolute powerlessness, before his fragile ego violently overcompensated, twisting his features into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. "What the hell is she doing here?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking, echoing shrilly down the long hallway, causing the IT techs and the legal team to freeze in their tracks. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his eyes darting frantically to the security detail. "I told you she was banned from the premises. This is corporate espionage. She hacked the mainframe. Arrest her right now." I didn't stop walking. I didn't speed up. I maintained my measured, rhythmic pace, the click of my heels cutting through his hysterical shouting like a metronome of doom, Leo matching my stride perfectly. an unspoken promise of violence if Preston dared to cross the physical distance between us. "Security!" Preston shrieked, his voice reaching a fever pitch as he realized Daryl was standing behind me, making absolutely no move to intervene. "Daryl, you're fired. Throw her out or I will have you all brought up on federal charges." I finally stopped, standing exactly 6 feet away from the boy who had tried to publicly humiliate me on my wedding day. I looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect pinned to a board. The entire floor was dead silent, every eye locked on the confrontation. "You can't arrest the landlord, Preston," I said, my voice deliberately soft, forcing him to strain to hear me over the sound of his own ragged breathing. "You don't own the house anymore. You just broke the locks and panicked when the lights went out." Preston's mouth opened and closed, a pathetic, wordless stutter as he tried to formulate a threat that carried any weight. You stole my company's property. I'm the CEO. I fired you and you threw a tantrum and sabotaged a $50 million supply chain. The board is going to destroy you. The DOJ is going to lock you away." He was hyperventilating, the sweat beading on his forehead, his desperate attempt to gaslight me entirely pathetic in the face of my absolute calm. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of heavy stock legal paper, holding it between my index and middle finger. "This is a certified copy of the intellectual property licensing agreement you failed to read before you sent that text message on Saturday night," I explained, my tone reminiscent of a weary teacher addressing a remarkably slow child. "It explicitly states that the predictive routing algorithm running Onyx Logistics is my personal private property. It was licensed to this corporation strictly under the condition of my continued unbroken employment. When you terminated me without cause, you didn't just fire your COO. You legally ordered the immediate automated repossession of my digital assets. I didn't hack anything, Preston. I just took my property and went home." Preston stared at the paper, the blood draining completely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. The legal team behind him suddenly looked away, staring at the floor, confirming that they had finally read the fine stared at the paper, the blood draining completely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. The legal team behind him suddenly looked away, staring at the floor, confirming that they had finally read the fine print and realized how monumentally screwed they were. You can't do this," Preston whispered, his voice trembling, the arrogant bravado completely evaporating, replaced by the whining, pathetic tone of a child facing the consequences of a tantrum. My dad gave me this company. You owe us. We gave you everything." A dark, bitter amusement flickered in my chest, a fleeting reminder of the exact same transactional entitlement my mother and sister had weaponized against me for years. They all spoke the same language. They all believed my genius, my labor, and my sacrifice were simply natural resources for them to mine and discard at their convenience. "You gave me a paycheck to build your father's empire," I corrected him, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that sent a visible shiver down his spine. "I gave you a company that functioned, but you got greedy, Preston. You got sloppy, and now you have nothing." Before he could respond, before he could beg or scream or collapse, the heavy frosted glass doors of the main boardroom opened with a solid, definitive click. Standing in the doorway was Arthur, the founder of Onyx, looking as though he had aged 20 years over the weekend. His shoulders were slumped, his face lined with profound exhaustion and the bitter realization that his blind nepotism had destroyed his life's work. Behind him, seated at the massive mahogany table, were the 3 primary venture capitalists, ruthless, unsentimental billionaires who had collectively poured $200 million into Onyx, men who did not tolerate incompetence and who certainly did not tolerate losing money. Arthur looked at his son, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of disgust and sorrow, before his gaze shifted to me. He didn't look angry. He looked utterly, completely defeated. "Nia," Arthur rasped, his voice rough and hollow, "they want to see you. Now. I didn't look at Preston again. I simply stepped around him, leaving him trembling in the hallway like a discarded ghost, and walked through the doors of the boardroom, Leo a silent, lethal shadow at my back, stepping onto the battlefield to officially claim the crown they had foolishly forced me to forge. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind Leo and me, instantly muting the chaotic, hysterical shouting of Preston in the hallway and sealing us inside a soundproof vault of absolute concentrated power. The room was expansive, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic gray-tinted view of the paralyzed shipping yards below. But the true gravity of the space emanated entirely from the far end of the massive conference table. Seated there were Richard Vance, Elias Thorne, and Eleanor DuPont, the three principal venture capitalists who collectively controlled the $200 million lifeblood of Onyx Logistics. These were not men and women who tolerated emotional outbursts. They were apex predators of the financial world, ruthless pragmatists who viewed corporate loyalty as a liability and measured human worth entirely in profit margins and risk mitigation. Arthur sat at the opposite end, looking like a hollowed-out shell of the formidable patriarch I had worked under for a decade, his hands resting flat on the polished wood, trembling slightly. Preston burst through the doors a second later, his face flushed with a desperate manic energy, completely oblivious to the lethal shift in the room's atmosphere. He marched straight toward his father, pointing an accusatory finger back at me. "Dad, she's trying to extort us. I want security to throw her out, and I want the legal department to file an injunction against her right now." Preston's voice was too loud, too shrill, entirely devoid of the cold, calculated baritone required in a room full of billionaires. Richard Vance, a silver-haired titan who had famously dismantled 3 Fortune 500 companies before his 50th birthday, didn't even look at Preston. He kept his slate-gray eyes locked entirely on me. "Sit down, Preston," Eleanor DuPont said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, a smooth, cultured drawl that carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. Preston froze, his mouth half open, looking toward Eleanor as if he couldn't comprehend being spoken to like a disobedient child in his own building. "Eleanor, you don't understand. I said sit down," Eleanor repeated, her tone dropping a fraction of an octave, freezing the air in the room. "Every second you speak is costing this table approximately $14,000 in delayed freight logistics. You will not cost me another dime with your fragile ego." Preston swallowed hard, the remaining color draining from his face as he slumped into the nearest leather chair, completely emasculated in front of the executives he had spent the last 2 days trying to impress. Richard folded his hands on the table, turning his attention to me with a look of profound, almost respectful calculation. "Miss Nia," he began, deliberately omitting the former prefix, "it appears we have found ourselves in a rather catastrophic operational blackout." The board was under the impression that the proprietary predictive routing algorithm was a corporate asset, built during company time, utilizing company resources. I walked forward, my heels sinking silently into the plush carpet, and took the seat directly across from Richard, leaving Preston and Arthur entirely in my periphery. Leo stood immediately behind my right shoulder, a silent, imposing guardian of my peace and my intellectual property. "The board was under a convenient assumption, Mr. Vance," I replied smoothly, my voice calm and perfectly modulated, leaning forward slightly. I coded the foundational architecture of the algorithm on my personal servers 2 years before Arthur promoted me to the executive suite. When Onyx faced bankruptcy 7 years ago, I drafted a highly specific conditional licensing agreement. It granted the corporation full operational access to my intellectual property, strictly contingent upon my active, unbroken employment as chief operating officer. I assumed Arthur had disclosed the nature of this digital infrastructure during your Series B funding audits. I let the implication hang in the air, a quiet, devastating accusation of Arthur's negligence. Richard's eyes flicked briefly to Arthur, a look of pure, unadulterated financial disgust crossing his features. He did not, Elias Thorne interjected, his voice sharp and precise. Arthur presented the algorithm as wholly owned proprietary tech. Had we known the central nervous system of a $50 million logistics firm was legally tethered to the continued employment of a single individual, we would have forced a buyout of the patent before we ever wired the first $100 million. Elias leaned back, his eyes narrowing at Arthur. You hid a critical vulnerability from your primary investors to protect your bottom line, Arthur. And then you handed the detonator to a boy who doesn't even know how to read a balance sheet. Arthur flinched as if he had been physically struck, his eyes dropping to the table. I never imagined Preston would terminate her. She is family. I thought the agreement was just a formality to make her feel secure. I felt a cold, bitter smile touch my lips. Family. That was the exact same word my mother and sister used whenever they needed to justify their exploitation. They used the word family not as a bond of unconditional love, but as a chain of infinite obligation, a magical phrase designed to silence my boundaries and guarantee my endless subservience. Arthur thought I would just absorb his son's abuse because of some misplaced loyalty to the empire I built for them. I was terminated via text message on the night of my wedding reception, Arthur, I said quietly, the absolute lack of emotion in my voice making the words hit twice as hard. Your son didn't just fire me. He executed a public humiliation in front of my entire family and Chicago's corporate elite to establish his new dominance. The algorithm didn't crash. It executed the legal parameters of its contract. It withdrew itself to protect my assets from an unauthorized user. Eleanor DuPont let out a low, dark chuckle, shaking her head as she looked at Preston with undisguised pity. You fired the architect to impress the bricklayers, she murmured. Astonishing. Preston gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white, unable to endure the silent execution of his character. She's holding us hostage, he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. We can just build a new system. We have a whole IT department. We don't need her. Richard Vance finally looked at Preston, his expression one of bored, terminal finality. Preston, your IT department has spent the last 36 hours trying to bypass a military-grade encryption firewall that Miss Nia built in her spare time. You cannot build a new system. By the time you draft the foundational code, your supply chain will have bled out. Your clients will have migrated to competitors, and this company will be in federal receivership. Richard turned his gaze back to me, his posture shifting from accusatory to transactional. The damage is severe, Miss Nia, but it is salvageable if the system is restored within the next 4 hours. We are prepared to void your termination immediately. We will reinstate you as Chief Operating Officer, double your equity shares, and frankly, Preston will be permanently removed from all executive decision-making. Turn the servers back on, and let's get back to making money. It was the ultimate validation. It was the exact offer that, 10 years ago, would have brought me to tears of gratitude. The billionaire titans of industry were begging me to save them, offering me the crown, the money, and the complete destruction of my enemy. They expected me to nod, to accept the generous apology, to slip back into my comfortable role as the brilliant, tireless savior who cleaned up the messes of incompetent men. They expected me to be reasonable. They had no idea that the woman who walked into this room was no longer interested in being a well-compensated mule. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap and looked directly into Richard's eyes. No! The single syllable dropped into the boardroom like a heavy stone into a still pond, the ripples of shock instantly visible on the faces of the 3 billionaires. Arthur let out a ragged gasp. Preston just stared, completely uncomprehending. "Excuse me," Richard asked, the polite transactional facade slipping just a fraction to reveal the sheer surprise beneath it. "I said no, Mr. Vance," I repeated, my voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat. "I am not returning to Onyx Logistics as an employee. I am not licensing my algorithm back to a company that operates under the delusion that my genius is a renewable, exploitable resource. I spent 10 years building this empire while Arthur took the credit, and I spent my wedding night watching his son try to destroy my dignity. My era of saving this family is officially over." Elias Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, the predatory instincts of a venture capitalist kicking in. "Miss Nia, if you refuse to license the software, this company goes bankrupt by Friday. Your own equity shares will be worthless. You are cutting off your nose to spite your face." "My equity shares are already worthless," I countered smoothly, resting my forearms on the table. Because the moment Preston terminated my employment without cause, he triggered Section 4, Paragraph B of your venture capital charter, the key man clause. The color completely vanished from Arthur's face. Eleanor DuPont sat up straight, a sharp, sudden realization dawning in her eyes. "The key man clause," Eleanor whispered, her gaze darting to Richard. "She's right." I held my ground, watching the terrifying mathematics process in their minds. "Your $200 million investment was legally contingent on my continued presence as the primary architect of the operational infrastructure. My unceremonious firing constitutes a material breach of that contract. You don't have to wait for the company to go bankrupt, Mr. Vance. You have the legal right at this exact second to pull your entire funding block out of Onyx Logistics." Preston looked back and forth between the billionaires and his father, the panic finally breaking through his thick skull. "Dad, what is she talking about? They can't just take the money?" "Shut up, Preston," Arthur whispered, a tear finally escaping his eye and rolling down his weathered cheek. "Just shut up, it's over." "It is over," Richard Vance agreed, his voice suddenly stripped of all warmth, a man who had just realized he was sitting in a burning building. He looked at Arthur, his eyes flat and dead. "You lied to us about the intellectual property, Arthur. You allowed your arrogant, incompetent son to terminate the only asset keeping this company viable, and you triggered a fatal breach of our investment charter. We are formally invoking the key man clause, effective immediately. We are withdrawing our $200 million in capital." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating and profoundly beautiful. In less than 10 minutes, without raising my voice, without shedding a single tear, and without engaging in a single screaming match, I had entirely dismantled the financial foundation of the men who thought they owned me. Preston collapsed back into his chair, his hands covering his face, the realization of his catastrophic failure finally crushing his fragile ego into dust. He had tried to execute me to prove he was a king, and instead, he had burned his entire kingdom to ash in 48 hours. But I wasn't finished. I didn't just come here to watch them lose their money. I came here to take what was mine. "Now that we have established that Onyx Logistics is fundamentally bankrupt," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence, drawing the immediate attention of the 3 billionaires who were already calculating their exit strategies, "I have a proposition. You want your money back, but liquidating Onyx's physical assets, the trucks, the warehouses, the real estate, will take years in federal court, and you will likely only recover pennies on the dollar." Richard narrowed his eyes, sensing the pivot, the true reason I had bothered to show up today. "Go on." "I am prepared to purchase the physical assets and the brand name of Onyx Logistics," I stated calmly, the ultimate checkmate materializing on the board. "I will buy the company for 20 cents on the dollar, complete controlling interest. I will immediately turn my servers back on, stabilizing the supply chain and preserving the client contracts. You will recoup a significant portion of your capital immediately through the buyout, rather than waiting years in bankruptcy court." Elias Thorne let out a sharp, incredulous breath. "You want to buy the company you just crippled?" "I am offering to salvage the wreckage your CEO created," I corrected him seamlessly. "But my offer comes with a non-negotiable condition. Preston is not just fired. He signs over his remaining family shares, and he walks away with absolutely nothing. And Arthur steps down entirely, forfeiting his golden parachute." Arthur looked up at me, his eyes wide with betrayal, the same pathetic look my mother gave me when I refused to pay her credit card bills. Nia, please. We're a family business. You can't take everything. You can't leave my son with nothing. He made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to be ruined." I looked at Arthur, feeling the final, lingering threads of my empathy for this family sever completely. They always demanded grace when they were caught, but they never offered it when they held the power. "He doesn't deserve to be ruined?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer, and took a step back from the table. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to explain my pain. I just needed to let the truth do the talking. I turned to Leo, who had been standing in perfect, lethal silence for the entire meeting. I gave him a single, subtle nod. "Show them why Preston really fired me, Leo," I said quietly. Leo stepped forward, placing the heavy leather briefcase on the polished mahogany table. The hollow thud echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block. The era of the billionaire's wrath was concluding, but the forensic guillotine was about to drop, and there would be absolutely no survivors. The sound of the solid brass latches on Leo's leather briefcase snapping open echoed through the dead silence of the boardroom like the chambering of a heavy round in a firing squad. I remained perfectly still, leaning back slightly in my leather executive chair, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I didn't look at Preston, who was currently trembling with a sickly, pale sweat, and I didn't look at Arthur, whose face had collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated dread. I kept my eyes locked with Richard Vance, the billionaire venture capitalist who was watching Leo with the sharp, predatory intensity of a great white shark detecting blood in the water. Leo moved with the methodical, unhurried precision of a seasoned forensic auditor who had dismantled men far smarter and far more powerful than the arrogant boy sweating at the end of the table. He extracted 3 thick, flawlessly bound legal dossiers from the velvet-lined interior of his briefcase, the heavy, premium paper stock thudding softly as he slid one across the polished mahogany to Richard, one to Eleanor DuPont, and the final one to Elias Thorne. He deliberately did not give one to Preston or Arthur. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen," Leo began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute, terrified attention, "is a comprehensive, fully verified forensic trace of Onyx Logistics' operational expenditures over the past 18 months. Specifically, it details the flow of capital authorized directly by the Office of the Chief Executive." Eleanor adjusted her designer reading glasses, her manicured fingers flipping open the heavy cover of the dossier. Her eyes, normally cool and detached, immediately narrowed as they scanned the highlighted ledgers on the first page. "These are vendor disbursements," she murmured, her cultured voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "Logistics consulting, fleet maintenance retainers, software optimization. Phantom vendors, miss." "DuPont," Leo corrected smoothly, resting his hands on the back of my chair. "If you turn to page 14, you will see the cross-referenced corporate registration data. Every single one of those consulting firms and maintenance contractors is a shell corporation registered to the same commercial P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware. They have no physical offices. They have no employees. They provide absolutely no services to this company." Elias Thorne leaned forward, his jaw tight, his finger tracing a line of data. The authorization signatures on these disbursements. They bypass the standard accounts payable secondary verification. Because they were authorized using the primary executive override codes, I interjected, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. I finally turned my gaze to Arthur, who was staring at the closed dossier in front of Elias, with wide, unblinking eyes. "The codes that you gave your son, Arthur, because you wanted him to feel like a real executive, without having to actually do the work." Arthur flinched, his chest heaving as he reached out a trembling hand, pulling Elias's open binder toward himself. Preston suddenly lunged forward, slamming both hands onto the table, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "This is a setup. She faked those documents. She's been hacking the mainframe all weekend. She planted those files to frame me because I fired her." He looked wildly between the three billionaires, his face contorted in a pathetic, desperate panic. "You can't believe her. She's a disgruntled employee. She's a criminal." Richard Vance slowly raised his head from the dossier. He didn't look angry. He looked absolutely, terminally disgusted. "Shut your mouth, Preston," Richard said softly, the quiet volume of his voice infinitely more terrifying than a scream. "This isn't an internal accounting spreadsheet. These are authenticated Swift wire transfer logs. These are offshore banking receipts routed through the Cayman Islands. You cannot fake a federal wire trace." Richard turned the dossier around, pointing a thick finger at a highlighted routing number. "You transferred $4.2 million of our investment capital into a private, irrevocable trust under your own name. You didn't even have the intelligence to use a proxy." The boardroom felt like it had been plunged into a vacuum. The sheer, staggering weight of the theft hung over the table, suffocating the last remnants of Preston's fragile bravado. For 10 years, I had watched this boy parade around the corporate headquarters in his bespoke suits, treating the warehouse staff like indentured servants, treating me like a glorified administrative assistant, and demanding respect he had never earned. He genuinely believed he was superior because he was born on third base and thought he had hit a triple. And yet, beneath the arrogance, beneath the entitlement, he was nothing more than a common, incredibly sloppy thief. He had mistaken my quiet dedication for stupidity. He thought that because I was busy running the day-to-day operations, keeping the company profitable, and shielding his father from the reality of the market, I wasn't watching the shadows. "Why did you think he fired me on a Saturday night in the middle of a wedding reception?" I asked the board, my voice perfectly level, stripping away the last illusion of the narrative Preston had tried to spin. It wasn't just petty ego. I was scheduled to initiate a comprehensive, multi-departmental financial audit next month in preparation for your Series C funding round. I would have found the missing $4 million on the first day. He knew I would never cover for him. He knew I would report him to the board. He had to eliminate me, immediately and publicly, hoping the shock and the humiliation would keep me distracted long enough for him to wipe the servers. He didn't realize, Leo added, his voice dripping with dark amusement, that my wife doesn't get distracted. She gets prepared. Eleanor DuPont closed the dossier with a sharp, decisive snap. She looked at Arthur, who was openly weeping, his tears falling silently onto the damning pages that documented his son's betrayal. "Your blind nepotism has cost us $4 million in stolen capital, Arthur," Eleanor stated, her tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "And his reckless attempt to cover his tracks has frozen a $50 million supply chain. Onyx is bleeding out as we speak." I didn't know," Arthur choked out, his voice a broken, hollow rasp. He turned to look at his son, the boy he had protected, coddled and elevated above far more qualified people simply because they shared the same last name. "Preston, how could you? After everything I gave you, I handed you the keys to the kingdom." Preston backed away from the table, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy glass doors as if calculating a physical escape. "Dad, it wasn't like that. The company was making so much money, I needed a safety net. The market is volatile. I was just securing our future." He sounded exactly like my mother whenever I caught her secretly racking up debt on credit cards under my name. The same pathological inability to take accountability, the same twisted justification that their theft was somehow a necessary act of survival. "You stole from my investors," Arthur whispered, his face hardening as the sorrow rapidly metastasized into a cold, absolute rage. He stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the mahogany table. "You destroyed my legacy to fund a private trust." Arthur looked at Richard Vance. "I will sign whatever you need. Take my equity. Take my golden parachute. Liquidate my assets to cover the $4 million. Just please, Richard, don't press charges. Don't send my boy to federal prison." It was the ultimate, predictable plea of a parent who had spent a lifetime shielding his child from the consequences of his actions. Even now, facing the total annihilation of his life's work, Arthur's instinct was to throw himself onto the grenade to save the boy who had pulled the pin. But this wasn't a family dispute over a broken vase. This was corporate fraud at the highest level, and the people sitting across the table did not deal in forgiveness. "It's too late for that, Arthur," Leo said quietly, the final lethal blow landing with the precision of a sniper's bullet. "What do you mean it's too late?" Arthur gasped, the last remnants of color draining from his face. "The dossiers in front of you are courtesy copies," Leo explained, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying nonchalance. The original, legally certified packets were digitally submitted to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Regional Office of the Department of Justice, and the Internal Revenue Service at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. They've had the files for over 2 hours. By this afternoon, federal agents will be walking through those glass doors with warrants for the servers, the offshore accounts, and your son. Preston let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. His knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands as the reality of his future finally crushed him. There would be no quiet resignation. There would be no golden parachute. There would be no second chances. He was going to a federal penitentiary. Arthur stared at Leo, his mouth open in silent horror, before his gaze slowly drifted to me. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if the loyal, tireless, accommodating black woman he had relied on for a decade had suddenly transformed into a monster. "Nia," he whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate accusation. "You sent it to the DOJ? You sent my son to prison. We treated you like family." I felt a cold, magnificent clarity wash over my mind. The word family, there it was again, the ultimate weapon of the entitled. "If he were family, Arthur, he wouldn't have tried to publicly ruin me to hide his theft," I replied, my voice steady, unblinking, and absolutely devoid of pity. "I didn't send your son to prison. His own greed sent him to prison. I just provided the postage." I turned my attention away from the broken patriarch and focused entirely on the 3 billionaires who actually held the power. They were not mourning Preston's demise. They were rapidly calculating the calculus of survival. Richard Vance tapped his pen against the table, his eyes locked on mine. "The DOJ investigation will freeze Onyx's corporate assets for months," Richard noted, his analytical mind already processing the legal ramifications. "The company will be toxic. Clients will flee. Not if the company is immediately acquired by a new, independent entity with no legal ties to the previous executive board," I countered seamlessly, the architecture of my plan locking into perfect place. "I have established a new holding company. I am offering an immediate all-cash buyout of Onyx Logistics' physical assets, fleet leases, and client contracts for 20 cents on the dollar. The venture capital group recovers a portion of their capital today. I will absorb the operational liability. I will turn the routing algorithm back on within 15 minutes of the ink drying on the contract. The trucks start moving. The medical supplies get delivered. The clients are informed that the company has undergone a sudden but complete restructuring under my leadership." I leaned forward, lowering my voice into a command that left no room for negotiation. "Preston's shares are surrendered to the DOJ for restitution. Arthur resigns immediately, forfeiting all severance, and signs a blanket, non-disclosure and non-compete agreement. You get out of a burning building with the clothes on your back, Mr. Vance, and I get the building." The boardroom fell completely silent. The only sound, the muffled, pathetic sobbing of the former CEO, echoing in the corner. Eleanor DuPont looked at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. It was the smile of a predator recognizing a peer. "You let him fire you," Eleanor murmured, a note of profound respect in her voice. "You knew he was stealing. You knew the algorithm would kill the supply chain. You orchestrated this entire collapse so you could buy the empire for pennies." I simply allowed Preston to be exactly who he is, I replied smoothly. "He dug the grave. I just refused to jump in it with him." Richard Vance looked at Elias, who gave a single definitive nod. Richard turned back to me. "We accept your terms, Miss Naya. Have your legal team send the acquisition paperwork to my office within the hour. We will force Arthur's resignation and Preston's immediate removal from the premises." Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "It will be a pleasure doing business with the new CEO." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Vance," I said, remaining seated until the three billionaires gathered their dossiers and exited the boardroom through the private executive doors, leaving me alone with the ruins of the family that had tried to destroy me. Arthur slowly walked over to Preston, putting a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. He looked like an old, defeated man who had suddenly realized that everything he had built was a lie. He didn't look at me again. He didn't try to apologize. He simply pulled his weeping son up from the chair and began to walk him toward the door, a dead man escorting a ghost. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer, the fabric cool and crisp beneath my fingers. I turned to Leo, who was quietly securing the clasps on his briefcase. He looked up at me, his dark eyes filled with an absolute, unwavering pride that made my chest tighten with a sudden, overwhelming warmth. For the first time in my life, I had not compromised my peace to save someone else. For the first time, I had drawn a boundary in concrete and let the people who crossed it break themselves against it. "Are you ready to go turn the lights back on, Madam CEO?" Leo asked softly, a small, brilliant smile playing on his lips. "Almost," I replied, picking up my phone from the table. I powered it on. The screen instantly flooded with dozens of new text messages and voicemails, not from the Onyx executives, but from my mother and sister. The financial panic had officially reached my family. The internal stock they had illegally leveraged was now completely worthless, and the reality of their own ruin was violently crashing down upon them. I didn't read the messages. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I simply deleted them all, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and walked out of the boardroom to claim my kingdom. 4 days had passed since the boardroom massacre, and the resulting silence in my life was nothing short of magnificent. A profound architectural quiet that felt entirely alien after decades of living inside the suffocating noise of other people's emergencies. It was Friday morning, and I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly leased executive suite in the Willis Tower, watching the gray, churning waters of Lake Michigan swallow the early morning fog. The air in this new sanctuary smelled of fresh paint, ozone, and the rich, dark Ethiopian espresso resting in the porcelain cup between my hands. There were no frantic phone calls, no passive-aggressive text messages demanding my time, and absolutely no ghosts of my past allowed past the reinforced glass doors of the lobby. Over the last 96 hours, the corporate landscape of Chicago logistics had been violently, flawlessly rewritten. The Department of Justice had executed their warrants on Onyx Logistics with terrifying efficiency, storming the corporate headquarters on Monday afternoon and dragging Preston out in handcuffs, his tear-streaked face broadcast across every local news network. Arthur had quietly resigned, forfeiting his severance just as I commanded, retreating into a shadow of shame he would never escape. Meanwhile, my newly formed holding company, Sterling Freight Integrations, had smoothly finalized the acquisition of Onyx's physical assets, instantly absorbing the fleet, the warehouses, and the client contracts. True to my word, I had reactivated the proprietary algorithm the moment the ink dried on the acquisition papers, breathing life back into the paralyzed supply chain and cementing my reputation not just as a brilliant operator, but as a ruthless, untouchable apex predator in the industry. But while my professional empire was rising from the ashes of their incompetence, the financial shockwaves of Onyx's collapse were systematically destroying the false reality my family had built upon my back. I took a slow sip of my espresso, savoring the bitter, complex heat, as the heavy oak door to my office clicked open. Leo walked in, looking devastatingly handsome in a navy blue bespoke suit, a sleek leather tablet tucked under his arm. He didn't speak immediately. He just walked over to where I was standing, wrapping one arm around my waist and pressing a soft kiss to my temple, his presence a steady, impenetrable wall of support. "The transition team just finalized the payroll integration," Leo murmured, his dark eyes scanning the Chicago skyline. "The trucks are moving, the docks are cleared, and the venture capitalists are officially out of our hair. You own it all, Mrs. Sterling." I leaned into his warmth, feeling the last lingering knot of tension at the base of my neck finally dissolve. "And the DOJ investigation?" I asked quietly. "Preston was denied bail," Leo replied, a dark, satisfied amusement coloring his tone. "He's sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for his arraignment. His offshore trust has been completely frozen, which means he can't afford private counsel. He's using a public defender." The poetic justice was absolute, a perfect symmetrical return on the cruelty he had dealt me. But before I could fully enjoy the thought of the arrogant boy king trading his tailored suits for a fluorescent orange jumpsuit, the sleek minimalist phone on my glass desk began to chime. It was a soft, unobtrusive sound, but it broke the tranquility of the room. I walked over and tapped the speaker button. "Yes, Sarah?" I asked, addressing my newly hired, fiercely competent executive assistant. "Miss Sterling, I apologize for the interruption." Sarah's voice came through, crisp and entirely professional. "Security from the ground floor lobby is on the line. There are 2 women down there demanding to see you. They claim to be your mother and your sister. The head of security said they are causing quite a scene, raising their voices and threatening to call the press if they aren't let up. He's asking for your authorization to have them forcibly removed by the local precinct." Leo raised an eyebrow, his jaw tightening immediately as he reached for the phone to give the order himself, but I held up a hand, stopping him. I looked at the digital clock on my desk. It was exactly 10:00 a.m. It had taken them exactly 4 days to hit absolute rock bottom. I had known this moment was coming. I had anticipated it with the cold mathematical certainty of a chess grandmaster watching their opponent move blindly into a trap. The internal stock that my mother had secretly leveraged to secure the loan on her sprawling 5-bedroom house was entirely tied to Onyx Logistics, a corporate entity that practically no longer existed. When the DOJ raided the headquarters and the venture capitalists pulled their funding, the valuation of those shares dropped to absolute zero. And Savannah's husband, Marcus, worked as a senior account manager for a third-party logistics brokerage, whose largest, most lucrative contract had been with Onyx, a contract I had personally, deliberately voided during the restructuring because I knew Marcus was just as entitled and lazy as his wife. The financial ecosystem they had built off my blood, sweat, and silence had completely evaporated. They weren't here to apologize for ruining my wedding. They weren't here to congratulate me on my new company. They were here because the ATM had swallowed their cards, and they were desperate for a bailout. "Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any emotional fluctuation, "tell security to issue them visitor passes. Have them escorted directly to the private conference room adjacent to my office. Do not offer them coffee or water. Leave them in there alone for 15 minutes and then let me know." "Understood, Miss Sterling," Sarah replied, disconnecting the line. Leo looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and profound respect. "Are you sure you want to do this, Nia? You owe them absolutely nothing. We can let the police drag them out of the lobby. You never have to look at them again." I walked back over to the window, watching a distant airplane cut through the low-hanging clouds. If I have the police drag them out, Leo, they will spend the rest of their lives playing the victim. My mother will stand up in her church on Sunday and weep about how her cruel, heartless daughter abandoned her to the wolves after making a fortune. Savannah will spin a narrative to our extended family about how the money changed me. I won't give them the satisfaction of an unresolved narrative. I am going to look them in the eye. I am going to close the door, and I am going to lock it from the outside. They need to hear the vault shut. Leo nodded slowly, understanding the psychological necessity of this final confrontation. He didn't offer to come with me. He knew this was a battle I had to fight alone, a final exorcism of the generational guilt that had weighed me down since I was a child. I waited exactly 15 minutes. I didn't review notes. I didn't pace the room. I didn't practice what I was going to say. I simply stood in the quiet of my office, gathering the immense, unyielding power of my own peace, pulling it around myself like an impenetrable cloak of armor. When Sarah buzzed my desk to confirm they were waiting, I smoothed the front of my white silk blouse, adjusted the cuffs of my slate gray blazer, and walked out of my office. The private conference room was a stark, intimidating space, featuring a massive slab of black marble for a table, surrounded by 12 leather chairs with floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying, vertical view of the city streets far below. When I opened the door, the sheer, pathetic desperation radiating from my mother and sister hit me like a physical wave. The contrast between the women who had mocked me at the Drake Hotel and the women sitting in my conference room was staggering. Savannah looked completely unraveled. Her hair was unkempt, her makeup was entirely absent, and she was wearing a simple, wrinkled trench coat over sweatpants, a far cry from the designer gown she usually paraded in. My mother, Yvonne, who normally held herself with the arrogant, untouchable posture of a neighborhood matriarch, looked small, frail, and violently anxious. She was clutching her leather handbag to her chest as if it were a life preserver. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the heavy, soundproof seals engaging, they both jumped, their heads snapping toward me. For a fraction of a second, the old programming flickered in my brain, the deeply ingrained childhood instinct to rush forward, comfort them, and ask how I could fix their pain. But the instinct died before it could even fully form, smothered by the memory of their cruel laughter echoing through my wedding reception. "Nia?" my mother gasped, her voice trembling as she stood up, taking a hesitant step toward me. "Oh, thank God! We thought—" "The security guards were so rude. Why didn't you answer our calls? We've been trying to reach you since Monday." I didn't move from the doorway. I didn't offer them a seat, and I didn't sit down myself. I simply looked at them, my expression completely blank, offering absolutely zero emotional real estate for them to land on. "You do not have my new phone number," I stated simply, my voice cool and detached, "and you are currently trespassing in a secure corporate facility. State your business, Yvonne, and be quick about it. I have a company to run." My mother flinched violently at the use of her first name, the reality of the severed bond finally beginning to penetrate her deep denial. "Yvonne, I am your mother, Nia. How can you speak to me like that after everything I've done for you?" She pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes filling with tears that I knew for an absolute fact were entirely manufactured for sympathy. "We are in trouble, baby. Real trouble. The bank. They sent a foreclosure notice yesterday. They are calling in the loan I took out against the Onyx shares. They said the shares are completely worthless because the company dissolved. They are going to take the house, Nia, the house you grew up in, the house your father bought." She moved closer, reaching out to touch my arm, but I took a single deliberate step back, a microscopic movement that screamed, "Do not touch me." "The bank is perfectly within its rights," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "You secretly leveraged internal, privately held corporate stock to secure a high-interest cash loan to fund a lifestyle you could not afford, without consulting the primary shareholder, me. You bet the house on the continued success of an algorithm you knew absolutely nothing about. That is the definition of reckless financial negligence." Savannah suddenly slammed her hands on the black marble table, unable to maintain the facade of a pleading sister, her natural toxic entitlement instantly boiling over. "Are you listening to yourself?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the stark room. "You sound like a corporate robot. This is your family. Marcus lost his job on Wednesday. His firm laid off his entire department because you canceled their freight contracts. We can't pay the mortgage, Nia. The kids' private school tuition is due next week. You did this. You orchestrated this entire buyout to ruin us." I turned my gaze to Savannah. my eyes narrowing just a fraction, projecting a cold, absolute authority that immediately silenced her. I orchestrated a buyout to save my intellectual property from a thief, I corrected her, my tone slicing through her hysteria like a scalpel. The fact that your husband is entirely useless and managed to lose his job simply because one contract was canceled is a testament to his incompetence, not my malice. If he were actually good at his job, his firm would have reassigned him, but he isn't. He's exactly like you, Savannah, a parasite who survived by attaching himself to the nearest host, and the host just died. Savannah gasped, stepping back as if she had been physically struck, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. My mother let out a loud, theatrical sob, dropping back into her chair and burying her face in her hands. "How can you be so cold?" Yvonne wept, the sound echoing hollowly off the glass walls. "I carried you for 9 months. I gave up my youth for you. You are punishing us because we made a mistake at your wedding. It was just a joke, Nia. Preston fired you. We were just trying to make light of a bad situation. You can't let your own flesh and blood be thrown out on the street over a joke." I stared at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no guilt. Just an overwhelming sense of profound exhaustion at her endless capacity for manipulation. "It wasn't a joke, Mother," I said quietly, the stillness in my voice forcing her to stop crying and look up at me. "It was an execution, and you didn't just watch. You handed the executioner the axe. For 33 years, I have been the unbreakable foundation of this family. I paid your debts. I funded Savannah's failed businesses. I endured the passive-aggressive insults, the constant belittling of my career, the whispering behind my back about how I thought I was better than everyone else, simply because I worked 80 hours a week while you slept. You hated my success, but you loved my money. You demanded that I be a strong black woman, but your definition of a strong black woman was just a mule that never complained about the weight." I slowly walked toward the table, resting my fingertips on the cool black marble, leaning in just slightly. "You didn't love me, Mother. You loved my utility. You loved what I could provide. When Preston fired me via text message, you didn't see your daughter's heart breaking. You didn't see my career collapsing. You saw an opportunity to finally put me in my place. You smiled, you laughed, you drank my champagne, and celebrated my humiliation because you thought stripping me of my title would finally break my spirit and make me exactly as miserable and dependent as you are." Yvonne stared at me, her face pale, the fake tears entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror, as she realized that her emotional gaslighting was completely ineffective. "Nia, please," she whispered, her voice cracking, dropping the demands and finally, truly begging. "I'll lose the house. I have nowhere to go. I'm your mother. You have millions now. You bought the whole company. Just write a check. Pay off the loan. I will never bother you again. I swear to God, Nia. Just don't let them take my home." Savannah was crying now too, real tears of absolute panic, realizing that the sister she had bullied and mocked her entire life was holding the power of life and death over her future. "Please, Nia, the kids. What about your nieces? You can't let them suffer because you hate me. We need help, just a bridge loan, just until Marcus finds a new job." The silence in the conference room stretched out, heavy, thick, and absolute. I looked at the two women who shared my blood, the women who had taken everything from me and demanded more, the women who only remembered they loved me when their walls were caving in. If I wrote the check, they would survive. They would keep the house. They would keep the private schools. And within 6 months, they would be right back to whispering behind my back, taking my money and resenting my existence. The cycle would never end until I broke the wheel. I stood up straight, letting my hands fall to my sides, the final unbreakable boundary snapping into place, a wall of solid steel separating my future from their past. "No." The single syllable dropped into the room with the finality of a judge's gavel striking the sounding block. Yvonne let out a sharp, breathless gasp. "What?" "I said no," I repeated, my voice as calm and steady as a heartbeat, entirely devoid of malice, anger, or vengeance. It was simply a statement of absolute fact. I will not write a check. I will not pay off your loan. I will not fund Marcus's unemployment. I am not punishing you, Mother. I am simply introducing you to the consequences of your own actions. You bet your financial security on my destruction and you lost. The house is gone, the money is gone, and I'm gone. You can't do this, Savannah screamed, her voice tearing at the edges, stepping toward me with her fists clenched. You are an absolute monster. You're going to burn in hell for abandoning your mother. I am not abandoning you, Savannah, I said softly, looking at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a stranger on a train. I am simply putting the burden down. You're an adult. Figure it out. I turned my back on them. I didn't wait to see if Yvonne collapsed. I didn't wait to see if Savannah threw something. I simply walked toward the heavy glass door, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. As I grasped the stainless steel handle, I looked over my shoulder one last time. Security is waiting in the hallway, I said, my voice cutting through the sound of my mother's genuine, terrified sobbing. If you ever attempt to enter this building again, or if you ever attempt to contact me, my husband, or my staff, I will file a permanent restraining order and I will have you both arrested for harassment. Consider this the absolute and final end of our relationship. Goodbye, Yvonne. I opened the door and walked out. Letting the heavy glass swing shut behind me, the soundproof seal instantly cutting off the hysterical screams of the sister who had mocked me and the mother who had used me. Two towering security guards immediately stepped forward, moving into the conference room to escort them out of the building, out of my life, and into the devastating reality of the bed they had made. I didn't stop walking. I moved down the immaculate sunlit hallway, passing the bustling desks of my new employees, hearing the hum of a multimillion-dollar empire operating flawlessly under my command. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The chronic, aching tension in my shoulders that I had carried since I was 20 years old was completely gone. I wasn't the golden goose anymore. I wasn't the sacrificial lamb. I wasn't the strong black woman required to absorb the trauma of everyone around her while slowly bleeding to death in silence. I pushed open the door to my private office. Leo was standing exactly where I had left him, a cup of fresh espresso waiting on my desk. He looked at me, searching my face for any sign of regret, any sign of heartbreak. I smiled. It was a genuine, radiant, breathtaking smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "Are they gone?" Leo asked softly, stepping forward and taking my hand. "They are gone," I whispered, looking out at the vast, infinite expanse of the city below me, feeling the absolute terrifying beauty of my new freedom. And they are never coming back. I picked up my coffee, leaning against my husband, ready to face the beautiful, quiet sovereignty of the rest of my life. 6 months later, the relentless, biting cold of the Chicago winter felt like an entirely different lifetime, a distant, gray memory completely washed away by the brilliant, blinding turquoise of the Indian Ocean, stretching endlessly beneath the sun-drenched terrace of our overwater villa in the Maldives. I was 33 years old, sitting in a plush-woven rattan lounger, the gentle rhythmic sound of the waves lapping against the wooden stilts of the deck providing a flawless, natural soundtrack to the most profound peace I had ever experienced in my entire life. I was wearing a simple, flowing white linen dress, my hair loose and catching the warm, salt-laced ocean breeze, a stark and deliberate departure from the severe, restrictive corporate armor I had worn like a second skin for the past decade. Resting on the low-glass table beside me was a perfectly pulled shot of dark espresso and a leather-bound portfolio containing the quarterly earnings report for Sterling Freight Integrations, the multi-million-dollar logistics empire I now owned with absolute, uncontested control. The transition had been ruthless, immaculate, and devastatingly efficient. Within weeks of the acquisition, I had purged the entire executive suite of Arthur's bloated, incompetent loyalists, replacing them with a diverse, fiercely intelligent team of operators who actually understood the foundational architecture of the predictive routing algorithm I had built. Without Preston's parasitic embezzlement draining the operational funds and without Arthur's blind nepotism shielding mediocrity, the company had not just stabilized, it had exploded, capturing 3 new international supply chain contracts and increasing our valuation by 40% in a single fiscal quarter. The venture capitalists, the billionaire predators who had initially looked at me as a desperate gamble, were now sending extravagant floral arrangements and invitations to exclusive summits. Recognizing that the woman they had once seen as a mere employee was, in fact, the undeniable apex predator of the industry. But the true victory of the last 6 months was not measured in profit margins or corporate acquisitions. It was measured in the magnificent architectural silence of my personal life, a silence that had been bought and paid for with the definitive severing of the toxic bloodlines that had nearly bled me dry. I picked up my espresso, the ceramic cup warm against my palms, as the heavy glass door of the villa slid open behind me. Leo walked out onto the sun deck, dressed in loose linen trousers and an unbuttoned silk shirt, looking incredibly relaxed and devastatingly handsome, the chronic tension of the forensic auditing world entirely smoothed from his features. He held a sleek silver tablet in one hand, a quiet, knowing smile playing on his lips as he walked over and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of my head before taking the seat next to me. "The Federal Circuit Court in Illinois just updated their public docket," Leo murmured, his deep voice blending seamlessly with the sound of the ocean, sliding the tablet across the glass table so I could see the screen. I didn't reach for it immediately. I simply lowered my sunglasses, letting my eyes trace the stark, black and white text of the legal summary. It was the final sentencing decree for Preston. The Department of Justice had been entirely merciless. Because Preston had attempted to move the stolen $4 million across international borders into an offshore trust, the federal prosecutors had elevated the charges to aggravated wire fraud and international money laundering, entirely removing the possibility of a lenient white-collar plea deal. The judge, an incredibly stern woman who had zero tolerance for arrogant corporate heirs, had explicitly cited Preston's utter lack of remorse and his initial, cowardly attempt to frame a female executive for his crimes as the primary factors in her decision. He was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Arthur's golden boy, the entitled prince who had fired me via a text message to prove his dominance, was currently being processed into the federal prison system, trading his bespoke Italian suits for a fluorescent orange jumpsuit stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom. Arthur collapsed in the courtroom when the sentence was read, Leo added quietly, his tone devoid of pity, merely reporting the inevitable mechanics of consequence. His attorneys had to escort him out. The civil asset forfeiture completely wiped out his retirement accounts to pay the restitution to the SEC. He's essentially bankrupt, living in a rented condo in the suburbs, spending his days visiting his son through a pane of bulletproof glass. I looked out at the horizon, where the brilliant blue of the sky met the deep sapphire of the sea, feeling a profound, absolute stillness in my chest. 10 years ago, the thought of Arthur's empire collapsing would have sent me into a frantic, self-sacrificing panic, driving me to work 100 hours a week to save him from his own mistakes. Today, the news of their absolute ruin felt like nothing more than reading the weather report for a city I no longer lived in. He built a kingdom on a foundation of lies, and he handed the crown to a boy who only knew how to break things, I said softly, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The collapse was always inevitable. I just stopped being the pillar that held the roof up. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes and letting the equatorial sun warm my face, my mind drifting to the other half of the generational curse I had finally broken. I hadn't spoken a single word to my mother, Yvonne, or my sister, Savannah. Since the morning I walked out of that glass conference room and instructed security to remove them from my building. I had legally changed my phone numbers, scrubbed my private residential addresses from all public records, and hired a boutique security firm to ensure that any physical or digital attempt to contact me was immediately intercepted and met with a cease and desist order. But even without direct contact, the reality of their situation was unavoidable, an absolute spectacular financial implosion that played out exactly as I had predicted. When the Onyx shares were declared legally worthless, the bank had ruthlessly foreclosed on the sprawling 5-bedroom house my mother had illegally leveraged. The property had been auctioned off in less than 30 days, a brutal public eviction that had stripped Yvonne of the fake, matriarchal neighborhood status she had worshipped above all else. Without my open checkbook to cover the devastating gap in their finances, the illusion of their wealth evaporated overnight. Savannah's husband, Marcus, unable to find an executive position because he possessed absolutely no actual skills, had been forced to take a mid-level warehouse management job working the graveyard shift just to keep their children in public school, their private school tuition having defaulted months ago. They were currently crammed into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, less desirable suburb, suffocating in the exact reality they had created for themselves. For 33 years, they had demanded that I be the unbreakable mule. They had weaponized the concept of family, twisting it into a financial and emotional extortion racket, conditioning me to believe that my only value in this world was my ability to absorb their trauma, pay their debts, and endure their disrespect with a silent, forgiving smile. They thought they were entitled to my genius, my labor, and my youth, viewing my success not as something to be celebrated, but as a natural resource for them to mine until I was hollow. They genuinely believed that because I was a strong Black woman, I would never actually leave them, assuming that my deeply ingrained cultural sense of duty would always override my desire for basic human respect. They were wrong. The greatest, most terrifying revelation of my life was the realization that my grace was not an unlimited currency meant to be spent on people who actively participated in my destruction. I didn't owe them my intellectual property. I didn't owe them a financial bailout, and I absolutely did not owe them my presence in a dynamic where I was only loved when I was bleeding for them. "You're thinking about them," Leo said, his voice gentle, his hand reaching out to cover mine, his thumb stroking the heavy silver heirloom ring I wore on my right hand, the only physical thing I had kept from my past, a reminder of the iron-clad boundaries I had forged. I opened my eyes, turning to look at the man who had stood beside me in the fire, the man who had never once asked me to shrink myself to make him feel larger. "I'm thinking about the woman I used to be," I corrected him smoothly, my lips curving into a genuine, unburdened smile. "I'm thinking about the 22-year-old girl who took that job at Onyx to pay her mother's second mortgage, terrified that if she failed, she would be unlovable. I spent my entire 20s carrying the weight of a family that secretly resented my strength, and a company that actively exploited my brilliance. They took my youth, Leo, but they couldn't take my mind, and they couldn't take my future." I slipped my hand from beneath his, reaching up to gently trace the line of his jaw. "I am 33 years old. Most people spend their 30s trying to recover from the mistakes they made in their 20s. I spent my 20s building an empire for ungrateful men, and I am spending my 30s ruling it. I don't feel old. I don't feel exhausted. For the first time in my life, I feel completely, untouchably young. I am finally living on my own timeline." Leo smiled, a deep, resonant look of absolute adoration and profound respect illuminating his dark eyes. He didn't offer a cliché platitude. He didn't tell me I was brave. He simply acknowledged the absolute truth of the kingdom I had conquered. "You built the algorithm that saved them, Nia. You built the firewall that destroyed them. And then you built the holding company that bought the ashes," Leo murmured, leaning in until our foreheads rested against each other, the warmth of his breath mixing with the salt air. "You are not just a survivor, Mrs. Sterling. You are the architect of your own universe, and they are completely locked out. I closed my eyes, letting his words settle deep into my bones, filling the vast, beautiful spaces where the guilt and the obligation used to reside. He was right. The era of the sacrificial daughter was dead and buried. The era of the accommodating, easily manipulated corporate executive was over. The suffocating cape of the strong black woman that required me to save everyone else while I drowned had been unbuckled and left on the floor of that Chicago boardroom. I sat back, picking up my espresso and looking out over the endless, glittering expanse of the Indian Ocean, a kingdom of light and water that belonged entirely to me. I was no longer the backbone of a family that refused to stand on its own 2 feet. I was no longer the ghost in the machine of a company that refused to acknowledge my name. I was a Savoan entity, a woman who had finally realized that the heaviest burden she ever carried was the belief that she had to carry anything at all. The silence of the Maldives was absolute, unbroken by panicked phone calls, unbothered by the desperation of toxic bloodlines, and untainted by the demands of mediocre men. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark coffee, feeling the heat bloom in my chest, a perfect reflection of the quiet, unstoppable fire that now burned within me. I didn't just survive the fire they set to burn me. I became the fire, and I used the ashes to build my throne. I looked at the horizon, drawing in a long, deep breath of the immaculate air, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that I would never, ever